to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself standing in a bright, dry, gleaming room with the spirit standing, smiling by his side, looking at this same nephew. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things that, while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed, Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, laughed out lustily. "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live," said Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it, too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "Bless those women. They never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest." She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory too. Oh, very satisfactory. "He's a comic old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth. And not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, for they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were huddled round the fire by lamplight. "Well, I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't much faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper clearly had his eye on one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, because he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. And whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or a catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while, they played at forfeits. For it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, whose mighty founder was a child himself. There was first a game at Blind Man's Bluff, though, and I no more believe Topper was really blinded than I believe he had eyes in his boots. Because the way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping into the piano, smothering himself in the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anyone else. If you had stood against him and stood there, he would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would immediately have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. "Here is a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, Spirit? Only one?" It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what, he only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, a rather disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes and lived in London and walked about the streets and wasn't made a show of and wasn't led by anybody and didn't live in a menagerie and was never killed in a market and was not a horse or an ass or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At every new question put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter and was so inexpressibly tickled that he had to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last, the plump sister cried out, "I have found it out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is." "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the answer to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes. Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have drank to the unconscious company in an inaudible speech. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the ghost were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirits stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, they were close at home. By struggling men, they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his brief little authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge's precepts. Suddenly, as they stood together in an open space, the bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, saw it no more.